Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 82 of ShamanTalk. My name's Rhonda and I'm your host. This week we're talking about the dreaded spiritual bypass. We're going to go into how we can recognise different types of spiritual bypassing and how then we can avoid it for ourselves. But spiritual bypassing is a very persistent shadow of spirituality. There's a quote here: spiritual bypassing is a very persistent shadow of spirituality, manifesting in many forms, often without being acknowledged. R. Augustus. And the reason that I brought this up this week is I think that it's a really important thing to talk about. It's an important thing to acknowledge, and it's something that I work with quite closely, making sure that I'm not falling into any of these traps, making sure that I'm not bypassing any of my work. And occasionally I find that I've fallen into one of these traps. So the first thing to say before we get started in this podcast is that there's no blame here. We don't do blame. We do recognition. We do opening our hearts to the next step forward. So if this ends up being the next step forward for you, then think about it as a triumph. Think about it as the universe giving you the information that you need in order to move forward. I never want any of these podcasts or any of this information to be used as a stick for you to beat yourself up with and for you to fall into a victim state with. So if you recognise any of these and you start to fall into the victim state, woe is me, I've been spiritually bypassing, that's not what this is about. Pull yourself together and thank your guides for bringing you this information. All right, so that's the first thing to say. So what do you think of when you think of spirituality? I don't know, often you'll think of transcendental, heightened states of being, feelings of joy and deep peace and contentment. You might think of like forests of paradise and ascended masters and angels and sunsets and beautiful temples. You might think of nature and what else? Just anything like that, kind of like your feeling of spirituality. So while all of this is true and wonderful, many of us can get a wee bit distracted and intoxicated by these attractive images of spirituality, okay? And then we end up avoiding the darker, painful, more exhausting sides of a spiritual path. So at its core, basically, spiritual bypassing is an avoidance. For a short time, it will reward us with feelings of security and happiness, feeling like we're connected with all these things I've just talked about. But actually what we're doing is we're undermining the deeper opportunity for self-growth and transformation, where we end up actually avoiding the very thing that we're searching for. It's just such an enticing form of escapism. C.G. Jung says, what you resist persists. So there's lots of things out there that you can read. Psychic women promoting their services, books on optimism and attracting love and prosperity and casting spells and all this stuff. But within all of that, there's a reality for me that's really missing. And a lot of the things that are offered these days, or a lot of the things people are doing, is a form of spiritual bypassing, unfortunately. So this term was originally coined by a psychologist called John Wellwood in the 80s, and he says this: spiritual bypassing is a term I coined to describe a process I saw happening in the Buddhist community I was in, and also in myself. Although most of us were sincerely trying to work on ourselves, I noticed a widespread tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So really that's what it's about, avoiding or escaping from the things you got to face. All right? So you're avoiding, suppressing or escaping from uncomfortable issues in life. And what we often find is that those issues just bark away at us in the background, whether they bark away at us through our dreams, through our unconscious behaviours. It's another, it's your shadow basically. You're suppressing your shadow. And we all know that the shadow comes out and roars eventually when it's ignored. In so many different ways. So, what can your uncomfortable issues be? Gosh, so many. A loss of a loved one, a relationship breakup, family problems, childhood abuse, loneliness, low self-esteem, self-sabotaging behaviours, fear, mental or emotional health issues, or just any other problems that life presents. And then spirituality becomes a kind of crutch for people. And what is really important to say is that that's necessary sometimes. We all need support. We all need support. And that's why we have a spiritual life. That's why we have a spiritual path. So I'm not saying don't ask for help. I'm not saying that our guides aren't there to support us. I'm not saying that the Centre for Shamanism isn't there to help you and get you on your feet if you're in a space of need. But the problem comes when spirituality is used like a drug and we get dependent on it in order to bypass the darker elements of our life. And I see it all the time. It's kind of like you use the spirituality as a defence mechanism against your shadow, and it becomes our greatest hindrance. It really does. It prevents us from developing true courage, authenticity and wholeness. So, we're using spirituality as a solid wall to hide behind, and it traps us in this false space where occasionally we feel pretty good and happy, but most of the time we know that there's something wrong. Sometimes we have breakdowns. Sometimes we fall victim to the rhythms of life. For example, I know some people who say at this time of year, I always feel this bad. This is what always happens. That kind of thing. Or I'll hear people say, oh, I'm doing really well one minute and then the next minute I'm, back on the ground again and everything's the same. I've read these books and I've done this course and everything feels good, but then suddenly everything's the same as it was last year. It's that kind of trap that spiritual bypassing can put us in. And let's just remind ourselves that we're not interested in beating ourselves up about this. We're interested in finding out about it so that we can move forward effectively on a spiritual path. Okay? If your victim is rising, sort it out. Okay. Well, I'm feeling very feisty this week, aren't I? I think it's really important though. I think many of us, when we hear about things like this, have the tendency to fall into the victim state and then just simply do nothing about it, instead of seeing it as a real gift, a real opportunity for moving forward and for proper, deep, actual transformation in our life. Okay, so what are the types of spiritual bypassing that we can look at? I say this a lot. Shamanism, spirituality isn't all rainbows and roses. It's not always pretty. In fact, sometimes it can be the most shattering, life-altering, crazy time of our life when we have a spiritual awakening. But we need to recognise some of these bypasses so that we can continue with that really good work. Okay, so the first one, the optimistic bypass. So we all know people who are like, oh, everything's great, everything's wonderful, yep, just smile, no, like glass is full, focus on the positive, don't let a friend get you down, all that stuff. So the optimistic bypasser avoids realities of life. They avoid feeling angry. Usually they're anger phobic, don't like anger. They have an inability to deal with your negative emotions, never mind their own. So this type of bypass will be where you can't meet people in a negative space. So Again, there's so many layers to this. I mean, we could go on about this all day really, but if you've got someone in your life who is a victim and who's always negative, and you choose to put up boundaries, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the constant pathological need to avoid negative emotions, okay, by being forcefully optimistic, pathologically optimistic, okay. So that's one of them. The glorification bypass. This is a type of self-delusion that people use as a way to mask their perceived deficiencies or insecurities, for example. So it's used by those who like others to think that they're enlightened, superior, they've reached higher planes of existence. It's usually used by self-proclaimed masters, leaders, spiritual awakened souls, gurus, that kind of thing. So they put themselves up on a pedestal and expect you to bow to their superior position in the spiritual community. Absolutely bypassing all of their own work, and can be downright dangerous. I've heard quite a few of my clients have come to me, have really struggled with overcoming a person who has this bypass and who uses them as a stepping stone without any regard for their well-being. The victim bypass. So being a victim is a form of spiritual bypass, right? I'm so passionate about this. I get so passionate about this. But anyway, so people think that they're a victim of their gifts. So it takes away the pressure of responsibility for, creating a life that they really want for themselves, taking responsibility for their own happiness. So this is often used by people who've got extrasensory gifts, and they'll call themselves, and they'll think that due to their gifts that they're unable to feel happy or healthy. This drives me up the wall. As a trigger for me. I do have it on my list of shadow work to do. Definitely. I'm wondering how much of this. I'm just wondering why I get so triggered by it. So, as you all know, we're all in this process together. So I'm just acknowledging in this moment that this is something that I am working on. However, it doesn't mean that the information isn't very relevant. So identifying as an empath. So I did a whole podcast on that, becoming an empowered empath. So it's the same thing. This is a way to spiritually bypass stuff, right? So you're like, oh, my life, I'm an empath, I can't manage to go to the shop. This is other people just spray things at me. Their emotions are self-destructive and blah, blah, blah. Right? So you're blaming everybody else without really making any effort to put up boundaries or learn about energy. So there's a whole podcast. So if this is you and you've not listened to that podcast and you're like, oh shit, that's me, go and listen to the podcast and learn how to become an empowered empath for yourself. It's totally possible. I was exactly the same. Spent my life thinking that I couldn't manage things because I was picking up everybody else's energy, and I was. But it's absolutely possible and not even that difficult. But people get really defined by this. Yeah? So other labels people use are clairvoyant, indigo child, starseed, gifted healer, blah, blah, blah. All that, all those, not just because you use that label, it doesn't mean that you're in a victim bypass. However, often it can. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with those labels per se. It's just if you use them to fall into the victim bypass, then it's a problem. All right, enough on that one. So the altered bypass. So lots of spiritual seekers explore LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, other entheogens that expand the mind and perception of existence. Nothing wrong with that in itself, as long as you're safe and you're held in a sacred space and you're the person who's holding the space knows what they're doing. I mean, yeah, fine. But what I see, what is a spiritual bypass, is just spending your time on drugs. They're a way of escaping reality and avoiding committing to any personal work. So I know a lot of people who will do ayahuasca ceremonies, well, not recently, actually, in the past. I'll do a lot of ayahuasca ceremonies, one after the other, once a week sometimes. I mean, who can do an ayahuasca ceremony once a week and possibly hope to integrate what you've learned? I know ascended masters, I was going to say, or people who may become ascended masters when they leave this plane perhaps. But I know some stunningly beautiful human beings who work so authentically and amazingly, and they perhaps have experienced an ayahuasca or a mescaline journey or a DMT journey once and are still integrating the lessons that they took from that experience. So that's a great way to avoid the work, but make yourself feel like you're working. Alright, the external bypass. So looking outside yourself for help and guidance. So horoscopes, psychics, spiritual mediums. Now, again, I love astrology. I think that's great. I've got a few friends who are really excellent astrologers. I know psychics and I know spiritual mediums. But generally speaking, this may make me unpopular. Generally speaking, people get quite addicted to those external bits of information that they get from a medium or a horoscope or whatever. And you're really failing to tap into your own inner wisdom and strength. We all have the ability to receive our own messages, and it's so much more powerful when we can do that. And I often think that the external bypass is based in fear and mistrust of ourselves, our inability to make decisions, our inability to deal with anything tough that comes our way. We have to go and ask somebody else. Oh, my great granny will tell me what to do, or something like that. Now again, those modalities in themselves are, I know some wonderful astrologers. I mean, horoscopes and astrology are not the same thing, I realise, but astrology is wonderful. But the best astrologers I know will take you through a process and give you information that you can then put into practice and make changes in your life. I don't know. And the same with tarot as well. Tarot card readers, that's another one. People just go, what's my future? What am I getting? What's going to happen? It's nonsense. And it's not safe. And the reason it's not safe is because the future changes in every moment. So your future now may be different. And you know what? Lots of tarot card readers and psychics are right about what happens in the future. But the point you need to ask yourself is, why do you want to know? What can you possibly gain from that? How are you going to put that into practice now in your life to become an empowered human being living a good, authentic life? Most people I ask can't answer that question. So it's a big one to think about if this is something that you're into. The saint bypass. So as children, we're conditioned to believe that a spiritual person is always kind and compassionate and saintly. It can really leave us in that space of being super black and white, thinking that spiritual people can't have dark sides because that would make them unspiritual. It's also a bit of a hangover from Christianity, from our religious culture. And this is just avoiding your shadow self, basically. Overcompensating, thinking sweet heavenly exterior. Self-sacrifice is a major symptom of this type of bypassing as well. So, throwing yourself on the altar of whatever it is that you're throwing, your family or your work, and that means that you're a spiritual person. And usually people who struggle with the saint bypass don't have very good boundaries as well. It's another form of spiritual bypass. Alright, so there's a way to spiritually bypass with your guides as well. God, this is not a very upbeat podcast, but I do think it's really important and really useful. So hopefully you're still with me. But in some in some traditions, it'll be God who protects you, in others it'll be an angel or an animal or an ascended being. In shamanism, it's your spirit guides, your spiritual team. But the belief that our spirit guides are there to babysit us is a bit of a dangerous one. So a lot of us are new to this work, and that's fine. We do need a bit babysat at the beginning. But when we completely place our faith in the being without taking any responsibility for ourselves and for our lives, and thinking that just by connecting and doing journeys and being and having a spiritual team, that's the work, that's just sidestepping the tough development of courage and resilience. We need to really understand that we are part of that team. We are all part of the team together. Our spirit guides serve us. Our spirit guides teach us. They don't babysit us. We're not underneath them. They're not better. We are an important and an essential part of that team. And our job in that team is to do our spiritual and personal work so that we can channel whatever the teachings are that we're given in a way that isn't filtered through all of our shadow and crap and darkness that we're currently ignoring. Right, so we end up just getting the same thing. The same problems just keep coming back again and again and again because we're not dealing with whatever it is in the shadow that needs dealt with. And therefore we're not stepping up and being a fully engaged member of our spiritual team. So the prayer bypass, that's another one. Not a big prayer personally, but I know a lot of people do. So what prayer can often do is kind of circumvent your personal responsibility. So we put our faith in a higher being to solve all our problems and issues. We're just like praying it away, so to speak. So there's nothing wrong with praying. I love to pray. I don't do it very often, but I do pray sometimes. It can be a really healthy practice, but just can become limiting and misguided if we're not taking radical personal responsibility for ourselves and for our own life. Okay, just a couple more to go. Stick with me, guys. Stick with me. So next one is the guru bypass. So it can be really beneficial to follow a guru, a shaman, a spiritual teacher to learn and grow. You're all here in the Centre for Shamanism. There's nothing wrong with that. I have my teachers. I don't have a guru. It's not my thing, but what can happen is we become too attached to them. We project so much onto them. It can rapidly turn into another form of spiritual bypass. Now, in the centre, I try and avoid that by being vulnerable, by being honest about my own struggles and issues. I try and while I hold very strong boundaries and I hold space and do that to the best of my ability, I'm also not raising myself up above anybody else, and I don't allow or I try not to let anybody else do that to me. I don't want to be above you. I am not a guru. That's not my job. I'm here to, as far as my guides tell me, to create a doorway, a passageway that I open for you, and you can choose to walk through it or not. So I guess the temptation to worship means that people kind of forget the purpose of why we are in these groups and why we're here doing this work. And it's to integrate the essence of what comes through. It's not to exalt me or other gurus that you work with or shamans or spiritual teachers. And by treating the words, my words or anyone else's words, as the irrefutable truth and failing to think for yourself, you're starving yourself of true spiritual growth and transformation. You're cutting off your own guides, you're cutting off your own information. And you'll hear me say again and again and again, don't Google it. If you ask me a question, 80-90% of the time I'll tell you to go and ask your guides. I don't know the answers to your questions. What I can do is teach you to find out the answers for yourself, which is the whole point of what I do, actually. All right, so watch that one. And the final one is the judgment bypass, right? So often when we start on a spiritual path, we have a spiritual awakening, we really start to see through the lies, delusions and the crazy behaviours on this planet, right? And a lot of us get angry about it, or upset, or we feel hopeless and frustrated. Everything is wrong. You know, what about the animals, or the sea, or, you know, the refugees, or the war, or whatever it is that you're, you know, the native people of whatever country. It can be really easy to be pulled into then that process of self-righteous finger pointing. And I see this so much, and it drives me up. There's another one that drives me up the wall. Finger pointing, you know, there's a false sense of righteousness, and it takes us away from looking inside and working on ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't raise awareness of issues in the world. I'm not saying that you don't absolutely have the right to choose whether or not you eat meat, for example, or to choose whether or not to contribute to, I'm just trying to think of current issues, the Dakota pipeline access issue that the Native Americans were having over in America, or other indigenous populations are having problems all over the world. I'm not saying don't help. I'm not saying don't raise awareness. I'm not saying don't be part of that. But the problem is that it consumes people, and you move into a place of hopelessness with it, and also with righteousness. And as soon as somebody comes at me with any form of righteousness, I just switch off. I'm not interested. I can't hear your message, although I'm sure your message is very important. My sensibility is just kind of shut down to it because it's not authentic. And I can often feel when people are using it as a spiritual bypass. And it's not something that I do deliberately. It just happens. My body just closes down to it. And I think that at its root, this bypass, this righteous bypass or judgment bypass, is based in fear and avoidance. And it really is a powerful form of procrastination as well. So powerful. So there's probably many other forms of bypassing, but those are the ones that I decided to talk about today. So this is going to be a long podcast this week, guys, but hopefully you're still with me. So how do we stop spiritually bypassing? Well, there's a few ways that we can do that. So the spiritual bypass is slippery and conniving, and is so often disguised in light. Yeah. And it just takes so much ruthless self-honesty to see through the lies that we've been conditioned to believe or have told ourselves. And I have complete faith that everybody who listens to this podcast will be able to overcome their spiritual bypassing tendencies simply by knowing that they're there. And most of us, I'm quite sure, don't even realise that's what we're doing. A lot of the time I'm the same. I don't even realise until I maybe do a journey, or I'll get my wrist slapped by my guides in some way, or they'll stop talking to me, or they'll shut down, or something will happen and I'm like, oh shit, what's going on? I think I've sworn a few times in this podcast this week, sorry, but so here's some of the things that can really help with it. So having an open-minded attitude, right? You need to be willing to be wrong. You need to be willing to be totally off the mark. You need to be willing, even those of us who've been at this for a long time, or those of you who've been at this for a long time, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years sometimes even, you've got to be willing to be wrong, and you've got to be willing to say, okay, I've been fooling myself. Okay, and without that willingness, there's no point in even trying to work with this, because you'll just be shooting yourself in the foot before you even start. So an open-minded, willing attitude. It's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to go wrong. Nothing to be ashamed of. I know a lot of us have that kind of perfectionism issue, or the control issue, or the need to be right, or all of these annoying self-limiting beliefs. The feeling of not good enough, the belief of not being good enough, can also be a massive trigger to this process. oh well, it just kind of, if you move into the victim state with it, it can just put you in that space of thinking, I was my self-limiting belief about not being good enough was right, because look, I've been spiritually bypassing for 10 years. But you won't have been spiritually bypassing for the whole time. You will have learned things, you will have grown, you will have moved forward. But it's time now, maybe for the next step, the deeper step. Okay, so embrace your flawed humanity and just jump in, and you will never regret it. It's not always easy, by the way, but it does work, which is, I think, essentially why we're all here. We're looking to see what actually works. So you need to look at the light side. This is number 2. Look at the light and the dark of what you do, right? So create hypothetical scenarios. Like if you've got a guru, for example, what would you do if this guru or spiritual teacher said something that you fundamentally don't agree with? What would you do? How would you feel? Would you be devastated? Would you be beyond grief? Would it make you give up your whole spiritual life? Could be that you have that person on to a high pedestal. Yeah, stuff like that. So hypothetical scenarios can be really useful. Listening to your doubt as well is really good. So blind faith is not always good. Blind faith creates cults, for example. So you need to look at the yin and yang, or Shiva, the destroyer, and Shakti, the creator, if you want to think about it that way. But listening to your doubt, listening to the things that are niggling in the back of your mind. What have you been ignoring? What needs listened to and seen? Yeah, so light and dark. You can ask others for their opinion. Now, this always comes with, of course, you'll know this, those of you who listen to me all the time, but these come with massive disclaimers, right? So only ask people who you trust. You know, you're not going to ask somebody who you've got a difficult relationship, whether they think you're spiritually bypassing. So you're looking for healthy, respectful relationships. And then before you ask, you need to brace yourself and your ego for the answer that you're going to get. So soft, slow, deep breaths, all right? And if you're feeling overwhelmed, like with anger or defensiveness, say thank you, I really appreciate that. I'm going to have to call it a day there and process what you've told me. And I really appreciate your feedback and your honesty. And then go and think about it, all right? You can also use the groups for that. So those of you who are in the membership, that would be a good place to discuss possible bypassing tendencies. But you need to be ready for that again. In the community group, it's a little bit less, you're a little bit less able to do it in the community group just because there's a much tighter boundary on giving advice there. But you can still ask and see what other people have done, so people can give you their experience. All right. So there's lots of ways that you can ask for feedback and start to talk about it, because people who try and do this work themselves without any external feedback tend to get themselves in a bit of a tangled mess with it in their mind, because usually you don't know that you're spiritually bypassing. Your shadow's running the show, and it's just almost impossible to do that type of work by yourself. So don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. So next, we're looking to feel your pain. Who wants to do that? Nobody, but that is the thing to do. Facing painful emotions, grief, shame, rage, hatred, terror. You know, we all want to live a sparkly, sparkly life, but usually what happens in the beginning is that comes, we feel the sparkle, and then it goes away and we think we've done something wrong. We think, oh God, that's gone away, it's short-lived. And that's because a lot of people don't want to do the hard work or face the inner pain, which is what ultimately leads to long-lasting joy and fulfillment. It's what leads to what you're looking for. Now, it's not easy to do. Many people who listen to this podcast will have major mental health issues, will have major abuse issues, will have major trigger issues. So you may need the help of someone else, a therapist, a practitioner, a shaman, a spiritual counsellor, something like that. And, you know, we're looking for trauma-informed, depending on your specific issue, then trauma-informed is quite a good thing to look for. But it's, and you know, I get it, it's not a fun thing for most people to do. That's why we look for band-aids. That's why we look for quick fixes. That's why we just concentrate on the things that we like doing rather than the things that we need to be doing. But, you know, the pain needs... So I hear people say the pain needs dealt with sooner or later, but actually you can go the rest of your life without dealing with that pain. You can die and take it with you into the next life. You know, I mean, that's one of the reasons that this subject is really close to my heart, because my dad was a spiritual bypasser. He had probably the knowledge of an ascended master and the wisdom of a frog. Seriously, he did his best. But he just used spiritual band-aids all the time. He was never able to face his pain, and he died. And he never got to do all the things that he wanted to do or all the things he thought he could do. And he never got to watch us do it either. So by all means, don't bother. Take it to your grave. That's a bit harsh. But I think sometimes we need a bit of harshness. I think sometimes we need a bit of straight talking. So, in conclusion, it can be really, really deeply unsettling and even terrifying to tear down the veneer of illusion from our lives and stare into the face of truth. Yeah, that's I've not written down. That's not my words. Wait, what's her name? Alethea Luna. Got that from. I'm gonna say that again. I thought it was a beautiful statement. Oh, I've lost it. It can be deeply unsettling. It can be a deeply unsettling, even terrifying experience to tear down the veneer of illusion from our lives and stare into the face of truth. But the spiritual path is a process of destruction and purification. It requires you to set fire all hidden illusions and falsities so that life becomes clearer, deeper, expansive, liberating and joyful. So I really hope that this podcast this week has been useful for you. It's certainly useful for me to always go back over spiritual bypass and ensure that I'm doing my best to not do that. I'm sure many of you will resonate with this podcast this week. And let's just remind ourselves one last time, no victimhood here. We're thanking our guides for bringing us this information. Thank you for showing us a next step. Thank you for showing us a way forward. All right? So I'm going to suggest a couple of... in the activities and journeys section this week, you've got one thing to do. So it's not going to be a very long section. But do feel free to pop off and get a pen and a piece of paper, and I'll see you in just a sec. Alright, so wee short section this week. I'm suggesting one journey, and it's to find out if and how you're in the spiritual bypass game. Now, I'd like to bet that every single person in this group who listens to this podcast can find something that they spiritually bypass with. I think everybody does it to a lesser or greater extent. So let's find out. Let's do it. Let's dive in. So journey with your guides and ask to be shown if you have a tendency towards spiritual bypass. Ask to be shown how you can begin to overcome that tendency and any other information that will be relevant for you on your spiritual path. So you're going to be asked to be shown if you have a tendency towards spiritual bypass, which I suspect will be yes. Asked to be shown how you can begin to overcome that tendency. And I've forgotten the last bit. Hopefully you've written that down, but if not, it'll be in the show notes, and the show notes are That's funny. This is centreforshamanism.com/82, and you'll get this information there. So that's your activities and journey section. Really super simple. Are you in the game? How do you overcome it? And whatever it was I said the last time. I usually write these down, but that last bit came out of nowhere, so that's obviously a bit to be added. So this was a tough week. I believe this was a tough week. I believe lots of us will have lots of things to think about. Please do share in the group. Please do be part of the community. It's really important not to do this work by yourself. That's why we have the community. That's why we're all there together. That's why I'm in it all the time. I'm available to bear witness to your experience. All right? Just so you know you're not alone. And there's so many other people going through the same thing. We're all in this together. All right, guys, I'll see you in the group. And as always, same time, same place, next week. Hey, thank you so much for listening. We love it. We love you. We love connecting with you on our podcast. We're really pushing our Facebook community right now. It is where all the juicy shamanic stuff happens. So if you'd like to join us in that community, you'll find us on Facebook and look for the Centre for Shamanism community group. And we'll see you there.